Just a new nurse. That's what Dr. Marcus Hargrove called her during morning rounds, his voice carrying the particular contempt reserved for people he'd already decided didn't matter. Katie Rodriguez didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She continued checking the foredrip on the cardiac monitor in front of her like the words had bounced off glass. He had no idea what those hands had done. He had no idea that the woman in the faded scrubs and regulation ponytail had once extracted 14 people from a burning compound in Helmand Province while mortar rounds shook the ground beneath her boots. Dead wrong about her. Completely, catastrophically wrong. But that's the thing about legends who disappear, no one's looking for them anymore. Sacred Heart Hospital in Portland smelled like antiseptic mixed with burnt coffee and the particular staleness that comes from a building where people never sleep. Fluorescent lights cast green shadows across the cardiac ICU linoleum. The ventilator in room for 12 wheezed its mechanical rhythm. Katie moved through the ward like water, finding the path of least resistance, efficient and present but never quite visible, her movements economical and precise. Everything about her was designed to be forgotten the moment you looked away. She'd been at Sacred Heart for exactly 31 days. The other nurses didn't ask questions. She arrived at 5:45 a.m., 15 minutes before shift started. She left at 6:15 p.m., after charting was complete and the night shift had settled into their routines. She'd turned down 3 invitations to happy hour. She didn't eat lunch in the break room with the other staff. She didn't post pictures on the unit board or sign the birthday cards that circulated every Friday. She was, by every measure, a ghost wearing scrubs. In her locker, bottom drawer, wrapped in plastic, hidden beneath her spare shoes, sat a pair of combat boots. Desert tan, scuffed at the heels, the leather creased in ways that told the story of 18 years of walking through places most people only saw on news broadcasts. Helmand Province. 3 tours. 2 Purple Hearts. A silver star that she'd never mentioned to anyone, because officially, the operations in that province had never happened and Senior Chief Petty Officer K. Rodriguez had been dead on paper since 2019. The military had erased her so thoroughly that sometimes Katie wondered if the boots were real or just a very persistent memory. The burned scars on her forearms mapped a geography of her own, one scar from a helicopter fire near Sanjan Valley, another from an IED detonation 30 kilometers from Bagram, a third from a compound extraction that the Department of Defense would deny until the end of time. She covered them with long sleeves even when Portland heat crawled past 90 degrees. Long sleeves looked professional. Long sleeves didn't invite questions. Long sleeves were part of the uniform she'd built since the military ordered her to disappear. Katie's hands were steady during procedures. They'd held tourniquets during mass casualty situations. They'd run for lines with her eyes closed in blackout conditions. They'd performed needle decompression on a lance corporal whose pneumothorax had collapsed his lung at 0200 hours while sandstorms raged outside the FOB walls. Steady hands. Surgical hands. The hands of someone who'd operated under conditions that would make most trauma surgeons weep. The other nurses on the ICU floor noticed things without understanding them. They noticed she never trembled during code situations. They noticed her jaw would clench at a particular angle when someone spoke about the military, then release just as quickly. They noticed she moved toward emergencies instead of away from them. They didn't notice the way her eyes tracked exits in every room, or how she could assess a patient's condition in the 3 seconds it took to walk past their bed, or how she breathed like someone who'd learned to make her presence invisible. Dr. Marcus Hargrove had been the cardiothoracic chief at Sacred Heart for 11 years. His reputation was built on 3 things: surgical skill, ruthless hierarchy, and the kind of institutional power that comes from knowing the right people at the Oregon Medical Board. He was the type of physician who believed that the hospital existed for him to command, that nurses were subordinates whose job was to execute his orders without question or interpretation. He had silver hair that he wore with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no, and a voice that carried the particular contempt of men who'd never had to fight for anything. During morning rounds, Hargrove moved through the ICU like a general surveying conquered territory. His residents followed 2 steps behind him, clipboards held like shields. His fellows walked slightly ahead, opening doors, positioning themselves as human buffers between him and the actual work of medicine. Katie had learned his patterns in her 31 days at Sacred Heart. He arrived at 6:50 a.m., rounded on beds 1 through 6 by 7:10, took a conference call from the hospital board between 7:15 and 7:30, then returned for beds 7 through 12 by 7:45. She was charting on the nurse's station computer when the admission came through. Marine General Robert Marsh, age 63, presenting with acute chest pain and shortness of breath. Initial EKG showed ST elevation in the inferior leads. Troponin already elevated. Likely acute MIE, myocardial infarction, coming in hot, probably heading to the catheterization lab within the next 30 minutes if Hargrove ordered it and the cardiac surgeons confirmed. Katie pulled up the chart. She read the admission note. She read the EKG interpretation. She read the troponin values. And then she stopped breathing. General Robert Marsh. 63 years old. Command officer of the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse Company. The man who had pinned her son David's Bronze Star 3 months ago at Camp Lejeune. The man whose handshake in that photo was firm and genuine, whose eyes in the picture David had texted looked like the eyes of someone who actually saw his Marines as human beings instead of operational units. She hadn't seen David in 4 years. Not since the military had ordered her to disappear, and David, now a captain, had been transferred to Fort Sam Houston in Texas and then to operational theaters she couldn't ask about and wouldn't know if she could. For years of phone calls from burner numbers. For years of emails she deleted after reading. For years of being erased from her son's life because the Helmand extraction couldn't be known and therefore she couldn't be known and therefore the connection between them had to become invisible. Katie's hands were steady as she continued reading the chart. Her jaw was tight but controlled. Her breathing was even and measured. No one watching her would have seen anything except a new nurse, appropriately focused on patient information, professional and competent and utterly unremarkable. The next voice she heard was Hargrove's, cutting across the unit like a surgical blade. "What are you doing with that chart?" Katie didn't jump. She didn't turn. She continued reading the troponin values and made a note about the timeline of symptom onset before she moved her eyes to acknowledge him. "Reviewing the new admission, Doctor." Hargrove was already moving toward her. His residents and fellows parted like water. He leaned over her shoulder and actually snatched the chart away from her hands, not aggressively, but with the kind of casual dominance that made it clear he believed he had the right to every piece of information in his hospital at any moment he wanted it. "General Marsh is a VIP admission. High-profile case." His voice dropped, but it carried, deliberately carrying, Katie realized, for the benefit of the 3 residents now watching from the nurse's station. New nurses don't review VIP charts without authorization. Katie's eyes stayed on the computer screen in front of her. The monitor still showed the patient list. She could feel the heat of Hargrove's presence behind her. She could smell the cologne he wore, something expensive and aggressively masculine, like a man who needed the world to know he was important. "I should observe that case," one of the residents offered, the young woman's voice uncertain. "Absolutely not." Hargrove's tone shifted toward her with the speed of a predator recognizing different prey. "You'll assist me in cath lab. This is a teaching case, and you need to understand how complex pathology presents in high-profile patients." He turned back to Katie, and his voice slid into a register she'd already learned to recognize, the one he used when he was about to publicly diminish someone he'd already decided was beneath him. New nurses should observe, not presume expertise. Especially not with patients of this caliber. You understand? Katie turned to face him. Her composure was what she'd built over 18 years of taking orders in places where a trembling voice could get people killed. Her composure was absolute. "Yes, doctor." "Good. Stick to vital signs and basic monitoring. Let the real medical team handle the rest." He walked away. The residents followed. The fellow was already on the phone, presumably coordinating with cardiology. The unit returned to its usual rhythm of beeping monitors and soft voices and the constant low-level hum of machinery keeping people alive. Katie sat with her hands folded in her lap, perfectly still for exactly 1 minute. Then she resumed her charting, because that's what professional nurses did. They continued working. They didn't let contempt stick to them. They didn't let rage echo in their chests. They moved forward with their assigned tasks and remembered that visibility was dangerous. By the next morning, the chart incident had become institutional memory. A red-inked write-up appeared on the unit board, posted where every staff member would see it during their shift. K. Rodriguez, unauthorized chart access. Violation of patient privacy protocol. Dr. M. Hargrove, Chief of Cardiothoracic Surgery. Katie saw it at 5:48 a.m., 7 minutes after she arrived for her shift. She read it while pulling on her scrubs in the locker room. She folded her uniform precisely and closed her locker door and did not look at the write-up again. The thing about being erased once was that you learned how to erase yourself. It became muscle memory. She was drawing up medications for the morning medication pass when Hargrove appeared during rounds, moving through the unit with his residents and his fellows and his particular energy of controlled domination. He positioned himself at the nurse's station and spoke loud enough for everyone in the ICU to hear. "Ms. Rodriguez, I'd like to discuss your future at Sacred Heart. Perhaps a position in a less demanding department would be more appropriate. Something quieter. Post-acute care, perhaps. Skilled nursing facilities have a more relaxed approach to charting protocols." The implication hung in the air like a surgical instrument waiting to be used. 3 residents stood behind him, their clipboards held like shields, their eyes carefully focused on nothing. Katie continued preparing medications. She was prepping a 1 mg epinephrine dose for a patient in cardiogenic shock, drawing the medication from the 4 bag with precision, labeling it carefully. The needle slid into the rubber port with barely any sound. She set the medication down on the counter. She turned to face Hargrove. Her hands were steady. Her voice was even. Her composure was absolute and utterly impenetrable. "General Marsh deserves better than your ego, Doctor." The unit went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum. Hargrove's face went white, then red, then something between fury and confusion. His residents looked like they were holding their breath. The other nurses on the unit had stopped moving. Even the ventilators seemed quieter, as if the machines themselves were listening. Katie picked up her medication tray and walked toward the patient rooms to begin her medication pass. She moved like someone who'd just said a simple fact about the weather. Like she hadn't just broken every unspoken rule about hierarchy and deference and the proper way for a new nurse to address the cardiothoracic chief. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that General Robert Marsh had heard every word from his bed in room for 12, where he was sitting up against his pillows with his family around him, and his eyes, the eyes of a man who understood command and respect and the particular courage it took to tell the truth to someone with institutional power, were locked on hers with the absolute recognition of someone seeing a fellow warrior for the first time. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical dirge as Dr. Marcus Hargrove stepped into the physician lounge at 2:41 p.m., closing the door with the careful precision of a man about to weaponize his network. Katie couldn't hear him from the ICU, but within the hour, the hospital's organizational machinery would begin to move against her like a Black Hawk turbine finding its target. He held the phone to his ear, his voice smooth as polished steel. "Board chair? Marcus Hargrove. We have a situation, a nurse making unauthorized clinical decisions. Possible credential irregularities." A pause. "I need this documented. Now." He ended the call and dialed again. Each number was a deliberate strike. Each conversation laid groundwork. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't demanding. He was simply making calls to people who owed him favors, calls to people who understood that institutional credibility was a currency more valuable than cash. His brother-in-law sat on the hospital's legal committee. His golf partner chaired the credentialing board. The chief of nursing had accepted his recommendation on 2 high-profile hires. Hargrove understood power the way a cellist understands silence, as the space between notes that made the music possible. By noon, 2 hospital administrators appeared in the ICU. They didn't approach Katie directly. Instead, they requested her employment file with the polite firmness of people executing a predetermined protocol. Katie watched them carry the folder toward the administrative wing. She knew what they would find: a spotless 4-week record, perfect evaluations, a nursing degree from Oregon Health and Science University that was absolutely, verifiably real, because the military had spent $17,000 ensuring every document would withstand scrutiny. What they wouldn't find were the holes. The gaps. The 18 years that Senior Chief Petty Officer K. Rodriguez had spent in places that didn't exist, performing operations that officially never happened, saving lives in a theater where the rules of civility dissolved under desert heat and the weight of classified orders. By 3 p.m., the phone calls began in earnest. Katie didn't witness them, but she heard about them from Rachel, the ICU secretary with kind eyes and a conscience that was worth more than discretion. "They called your nursing school," Rachel whispered as Katie passed the desk. "Asked about verification procedures. Academic integrity." It was weird, like they already knew something was wrong but needed documentation. Katie's hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't accelerate. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint, the same restraint that had kept her alive in Kandahar when Taliban fire was close enough that she could smell the cordite mixed with dust and blood. She'd learned long ago that panic was a luxury, and she'd never been able to afford it. The combat boots in her locker felt heavier that afternoon, though they weighed exactly what they always had. She'd kept them there for 4 weeks without ever looking at them directly, just aware of their presence like you're aware of your own heartbeat. They were scuffed leather the color of dried sand, laces wrapped around the heel, the memory of a life she'd been ordered to bury. The left boot had a bullet graze across the instep from an ambush outside Lashkar Gah. The right boot held a patch of blood that had dried so long ago it looked like part of the leather itself. She'd learned that memory had its own weight. That wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she couldn't defend herself. How could she explain that her records were classified? That Senior Chief Petty Officer K. Rodriguez had been officially erased after the extraction, the operation where she'd rappelled into a compound held by Taliban fighters to retrieve a CIA asset, the operation that had resulted in 3 Purple Hearts and a fitness report so dense with commendations that it had immediately been sealed behind layers of military secrecy. How could she tell the hospital board that the nursing degree was real but the person holding it was supposed to cease existing? That she'd been ordered to disappear into civilian life because the operation never happened, the asset she'd saved never existed, the firefight that had left shrapnel in her left shoulder blade was classified at a level that meant if she acknowledged it in a hospital interview, federal agents would have questions. She couldn't explain that. She could only wait. General Marsh's condition shifted at 6 p.m. Katie was monitoring Mrs. Chen in room for 10 when she noticed his heart rate climbing, 118 beats per minute. Then 124. His blood pressure drifting downward, a drift so subtle that the automated monitor barely registered it. 138/82. Then 135/80. The kind of decline that looked like normal variation until you recognized it as the beginning of a curve. She pulled his chart without thinking, already reading the most recent lab work with the practiced eye of someone who'd watched vital sign patterns predict death in 100 variations. Troponin, 2.4. Elevated. Chest X-ray from that morning, clear. No fluid. No shadows. But the clinical presentation whispered what the imaging couldn't yet show. Elevated troponin. Declining blood pressure. Rising heart rate. The math of cardiac physiology that added up to a specific, terrifying diagnosis: pericardial effusion, fluid building around the heart sac, pressure increasing with each beat until the heart would no longer have room to function. Cardiac tamponade. Left untreated, he had maybe 48 hours. Maybe less. She knew the procedure. Needle pericardiocentesis, a 14-gauge needle between the ribs at a precise angle, the xiphoid process as your landmark, and then the careful, controlled withdrawal of that built-up fluid. She performed it in a forward surgical team in Helmand Province under indirect fire, hand steady because panic was the enemy and the general had been the patient then too, not this general, but someone under her care, someone whose life depended on her muscle memory and training and the absolute refusal to flinch when everything around you was designed to break you. Dr. Hargrove's order came at 6:36 p.m. Conservative monitoring. No intervention. No additional imaging. As if Katie's concerns, carefully framed as clinical observation and a general patient assessment, were the worried fussing of a new nurse rather than the professional warning of someone who'd kept trauma patients breathing in conditions that would make a crisis team weep. At 8 p.m., the administrator's office was already dark when they called her in. Just the desk lamp on, creating a circle of light that felt like interrogation. 2 administrators, she recognized them from the payroll system display, names she'd already forgotten because her brain was already compartmentalizing, already shifting into the operational mode that came naturally when institutions began moving against you. Ms. Rodriguez, pending investigation, you're restricted from General Marsh's care effective immediately. Katie nodded once. No protest. No argument. No explanation of the vital signs she'd tracked or the math that was running in her head like a countdown. She simply stood, said nothing, and walked out of the office. Her shift was finished anyway. Her access to the case was gone. The general would be managed by a doctor who saw him as a problem to be medicated rather than a patient whose body was already beginning to fail. The drive home took 34 minutes. Rain hammered Portland like applause for the end of a show nobody wanted to watch. Katie sat in her apartment on Northeast Burnside, the kind of place she'd rented because it was temporary, because she'd never planned to stay anywhere long enough to make roots. The walls were bare. The refrigerator held water and protein powder. She hadn't unpacked the boxes in the bedroom because Senior Chief Petty Officer K. Rodriguez didn't unpack. She moved through the world like a ghost, leaving no impression, requesting nothing, taking the job she was assigned and the identities the government provided and the civilian name, Katie Rodriguez, that felt like wearing someone else's skin. 2 days later, she sat in the Portland VA hospital waiting room holding an intake form. Form 10-10EZ. Veterans Health Eligibility and Enrollment Application. The waiting room smelled like old coffee and antiseptic and the particular weight of collective trauma. A room full of people who'd seen things that required ongoing management, ongoing medication, ongoing evidence of their service just to exist in the system that was supposed to take care of them. She filled out the form with her left hand while her right hand rested in her lap. The military address was redacted. The discharge date listed as honorable but everything else sealed, classified, restricted. She was a veteran now. Not a nurse. Not a healer. Not a senior chief who'd trained Marines and saved lives and carried classified operations in her bones like shrapnel. Just another person waiting for a number to be called, just another body in a system designed to process trauma rather than prevent it. Around her, men with prosthetics scrolled through their phones. A woman with a service dog sat perfectly still. An older gentleman stared out the window at the rain that was still falling, that never seemed to stop in Portland. They were all waiting to be seen. They were all reduced to their wounds rather than their strengths, to their damage rather than their capacity. Katie filled in her name on the form. Her social security number. Her service history, as much as she was allowed to disclose. And then she waited for her number to be called, thinking about a Marine general 3 miles away whose heart was beginning to fail, whose condition was deteriorating with every hour that passed, whose life was in the hands of a doctor who'd been trained to manage illness rather than recognize the whispered warnings of organ failure. She had 48 hours. Maybe less. And she couldn't do a single thing about it. The post-surgical recovery unit was a graveyard of beeping machines and dim overhead lights. Katie pushed a medication cart through the corridors of the 3rd floor, her movements deliberate and efficient, her eyes forward. Nobody looked at her anymore. The staff who'd gathered in break rooms had learned to scatter when she approached. She was contagious now, the kind of professional pariah who made other people nervous about their own futures. The assignment to post-surgical recovery was a deliberate choice by Hargrove. She understood this without needing explanation. The ICU, where General Marsh lay monitored under constant observation, was 3 floors up and locked behind electronic access that required department authorization. Katie's access card still worked for the ground floor, the cafeteria, the bathrooms. It did not work for the cardiac intensive care unit. The message was clear: you are removed. You are contained. You are watching from outside. She finished her shift at 11 p.m., clocked out, and sat in her car in the parking lot for exactly 4 minutes. The rain hammered the windshield like Morse code. Then she drove home, changed into dark scrubs, technically civilian clothes, indistinguishable from the 100 other nurses who worked in the hospital, and drove back. At 12:51 a.m., she used her ground floor access to enter Sacred Heart through the emergency department loading bay. Nobody questioned nurses arriving for the night shift. She moved through the corridors with the kind of invisibility that came from knowing how to occupy space without demanding attention. The third-floor break room had a computer terminal that looked directly into the hospital information system. She logged in using her credentials, which still functioned for viewing. Hargrove had only revoked her ability to add orders, not to read. The screen glowed pale blue in the darkness. Her fingers moved across the keyboard, muscle memory from 18 years, and the general's chart opened. Patient, Robert Marsh, 67-year-old male, post-cardiac catheterization status, Day 3 post-procedure. Vitals from the 11 p.m. nursing assessment: heart rate 104, blood pressure 118/72, respiratory rate 22, O2 saturation 97% on room air. The numbers told a story if you knew how to listen. The heart rate was climbing. 3 days post-procedure, the heart rate should be settling. Should be stable. It was not. She scrolled to the documentation. Dr. Hargrove's note from 10 p.m., patient resting comfortably. Denies chest pain. Post-procedure anxiety likely contributing to mild tachycardia. Continue current monitoring protocol. No intervention indicated at this time. The words were clinical, professional. They were also wrong. They were protective. He was defending his original assessment, the diagnosis he'd made before Katie had ever touched the general's chart, before she'd suggested the possibility of effusion. Hargrove was not a man who admitted error. He was a man who buried it. Katie moved to the vital signs graph. The trend line was a slow climb. 98 beats per minute at 6 a.m. 101 at noon. 104 at 11 p.m. The blood pressure was holding, for now. But the pulse pressure, the difference between systolic and diastolic, was narrowing. The body compensating. The heart working harder to move blood against increasing pressure. She knew what was happening in General Marsh's chest cavity. She knew it the way a pilot knows when an engine is about to fail. The sound changes. The vibration becomes wrong. The air pressure alters. At 1:14 a.m., she opened the nursing notes section and read the entry from the evening shift nurse, a junior RN named Torres, competent but without the training to recognize what he was seeing. Patient drowsy but easily arousable. Lung sounds clear bilaterally. Heart tones muffled, attributed to post-procedure pericardial inflammation. No acute distress noted. The muffled heart tones were documented and dismissed. The same way a pre-med student might notice a dark shadow on a chest X-ray and not understand it meant cancer. She minimized the chart and sat motionless in the break room. The fluorescent overhead lights buzzed their mechanical lament. Outside, the rain continued its violent percussion against the windows. The choice in front of her was surgical in its clarity: do nothing, maintain the pretense of following orders, watch the general's condition deteriorate until someone else had the courage to act, or enter the arena knowing that any intervention would be documented, noted, and used against her in the disciplinary hearing that was already being scheduled. She opened the chart again. It was 1:37 a.m. She clicked into the assessment section and began typing. Her fingers did not shake. They never did. Patient presents with compensatory tachycardia and muffled cardiac tones concerning for developing pericardial effusion with tamponade physiology. Recommend urgent echocardiography to assess for fluid accumulation and cardiac chamber compression. Current clinical deterioration pattern inconsistent with uncomplicated post-catheterization course. Immediate cardiology consultation advised. She signed it Senior Chief Petty Officer K. Rodriguez, RN, and hit post. The timestamp read 2:14 a.m. She logged out and sat in the darkness. The break room smelled of old coffee and the chemical scent of hand sanitizer. Her uniform was dry. Her pulse was steady. The same composure that had kept her alive in Helmand Province now kept her still while the machinery of her professional execution engaged. At 2:15 a.m., her badge access was electronically revoked. She watched the notification appear on her personal phone, the hospital's automated system alerting her that her keycard was no longer valid for restricted areas. It was not a message. It was a declaration. She walked anyway. Up the stairs to the 4th floor, down the corridor toward the ICU doors. The glass was tinted, reinforced for security. Inside, she could see monitors glowing, the organized chaos of night shift critical care. She could see General Marsh's bed, the one closest to the central station, the one reserved for the sickest patients. A nurse she didn't recognize was checking the 4 line. No Hargrove. He would come. She stood outside the locked doors like a woman on the wrong side of a border. Like a woman who had been erased and was now trying to cross back into her own life. At 2:32 a.m., the elevator doors opened behind her. Hargrove emerged, moving with the controlled fury of a man who had just discovered his authority being challenged. He was still in his button-down shirt from the day's shift, no white coat. He'd come back to the hospital in street clothes, summoned by an alert from the nursing notes section. His face was the color of old brick. He saw her standing at the glass doors and his jaw tightened as if she'd struck him. Step away from that door. His voice was a tank idling in a garage, all low horsepower threat. She didn't move. I said step away. You do not have access. Read my note. I have read your note. And I am reading it again right now to understand what possible justification you thought you had for. He stopped. His phone had vibrated. She watched his eye scan whatever message had just arrived, watched the color drain from his face like someone opening a refrigerator and finding something dead inside. He turned back toward his office without another word. At 2:45 a.m., 2 hospital investigators arrived with ID badges clipped to their belts. They moved with the forensic efficiency of people who had done this before. One of them approached Katie, still standing outside the ICU doors, and informed her that she was being placed on immediate investigative suspension pending review of her employment file. They had questions about her nursing school credentials. They had concerns about her previous references. They had received a report suggesting her background check might have been incomplete. Katie listened without speaking. This was the moment where everything collapsed. The Navy cover identity that had held for 3 months would not survive scrutiny. They would call the listed supervisor, a contact number that would ring to a Pentagon extension that nobody at Sacred Heart had authorization to access. They would receive a response so thoroughly classified that it would trigger more questions, more audits, more federal involvement. In attempting to save the general's life, she had just initiated the sequence that would expose every lie she'd built, every identity she'd assumed. Then the monitors inside the ICU began to scream. All of them. Every single alarm. A chorus of electronic distress that meant one thing: patient decompensation. The blood pressure had collapsed. The oxygen saturation was falling. The rhythm that appeared on the screen was the ineffective, desperate fluttering of a heart drowning in fluid that had nowhere else to go, a pericardial sac full of blood, pressing inward, crushing the chambers, reducing the general's ability to perfuse his brain with every heartbeat that failed to deliver adequate volume. Katie moved toward the emergency override panel mounted on the wall beside the ICU door. Every hospital in America had one. It was designed for exactly this moment, a life-threatening emergency that overrode all access protocols, all authorization levels, all hierarchy. She pressed her palm against the biometric reader and spoke her identification clearly: Senior Chief Rodriguez, requesting emergency access for life-threatening situation. The system recognized her. The doors released with a click and a hiss of pressurized air. Behind her, she heard Hargrove's voice crack as he shouted her name, but she was already inside the ICU, already moving toward the general's bed, already reading the monitor as if it were her native language. Heart rate 147. Blood pressure 64/41. O2 saturation 78 and falling. Respiratory rate 32, patient in obvious respiratory distress, the shallow gasping of someone whose heart was no longer pumping effectively. The night shift nurses scattered as she approached. They knew something in her movements, some quality of absolute authority, that made them step back automatically. There were no questions. There were no challenges. She reached for the equipment tray, her hands moving with the kind of precision that comes from having already made these movements 1,000 times before, in desert combat hospitals where the only light came from generator-powered lamps and the only hope came from someone who had seen the worst and would not accept it today. The cardiac monitor's wail cut through the ICU like a siren at 3 in the morning. Katie's hands were already moving before her brain caught up, muscle memory from 18 years of combat medicine operating at a frequency that transcended conscious thought. The general's blood pressure had cratered. 60/40 and dropping. His heart rate climbed to 140, a panicked rhythm that meant the heart was drowning in its own fluid. Oxygen saturation plummeting. 68%. 65. The room exploded with bodies and shouting, but Katie heard none of it. She heard only what the monitors were screaming, a man dying in real time. She reached General Marsh first. Her eyes registered what her hands already knew, the distended neck veins standing out like cords, the muffled heart sound she detected through the stethoscope, the classical Beck's triad of cardiac tamponade that Hargrove had been too arrogant to see. This was the same presentation she'd treated in a combat surgical hospital outside Helmand Province, under mortar fire, with nothing but field supplies and the knowledge that the wrong move meant death. But that was then. This was now. This was her second chance to save him, and she would not fail. Dr. Hargrove materialized through the curtain, his face already twisted in rage. Security! Get her out of this patient's room. Now! His voice was a weapon, sharp enough to draw blood. But Katie didn't acknowledge him. She didn't even pause. She moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had already made these decisions 1,000 times before, each movement economical, each gesture purposeful. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't crack. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. Cardiac tamponade, she said flatly. He's dying. Now. You are not authorized. Hargrove's face cycled from white to purple, rage and fear warring for dominance. Katie prepped the chest with antiseptic that smelled like copper and bleach mixed together. She identified her landmark, the 5th intercostal space, midclavicular line, and her fingers found the precise angle without hesitation. The needle advanced into the pericardial sac with a sensation like pushing through resistance, like the feel of a training dummy giving way under pressure. She felt it, and she knew. 200 cubic centimeters of blood-tinged fluid filled the syringe as she drew back. The hiss of air escaping. The release of pressure that had been crushing the general's heart. The monitor's tone changed. The frantic climbing numbers stabilized. Blood pressure climbed from 60 to 80 to 95. 100. The oxygen saturation rose, 72, 78, 84, 89. The general's color returned like sunrise breaking across a dark horizon. His heart rate dropped from 140 to 110 to 96. Sinus rhythm. Normal. Alive. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead, could hear the ventilator's mechanical breath, could hear the distant sound of rain beginning to fall outside the ICU windows. Dr. Hargrove's face had gone white as a medical coat. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. The ultrasound machine hung from his hands like a weapon he'd forgotten how to use, and Katie understood in that moment that he had known, had always known, what she'd just diagnosed. He'd simply chosen not to see it. "You just assaulted a patient with an unauthorized procedure," he whispered. But the words sounded hollow now. "Empty." He looked down at the fluid in the syringe, at the general's rising vital signs, at the evidence of his own negligence displayed in numbers no one could deny. Katie withdrew the needle with the same precision she'd inserted it. She labeled the specimen. She documented the procedure in the chart with clinical brevity: procedure, time, findings, fluid amount, response. There was no emotion in the words. There was only fact. She had saved the general's life. The machines confirmed it. The numbers proved it. And Dr. Hargrove had watched it happen. By 6 in the morning, the hospital's risk management team arrived. 2 administrators in press suits with clipboards and the kind of cold expressions that meant paperwork was about to become a weapon. By 8 o'clock, Hargrove had presented his case to the chief of staff. A nurse with suspicious credentials. An unauthorized procedure performed while under investigation for credential fraud. A direct violation of restricted access orders. A potential lawsuit waiting to happen. By noon, Katie heard the footsteps before she saw the security officer. His name was Marcus. He'd always nodded at her in the hallways. Now he looked at his feet. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "But I've been instructed to escort you out." Katie didn't argue. She couldn't. Any defense would require explaining the classified extraction, the CIA asset, the operation that officially never happened. She gathered her belongings in a cardboard box: her stethoscope, her badge, a change of scrubs, the photograph of David in his dress uniform taken 6 months ago. She didn't look back at the nurse's station. Didn't make eye contact with the staff watching from the break room. Her composure held like a fortress wall as Marcus walked her to the security desk, where another officer cut her ID badge in half with methodical precision. The sound of scissors through plastic. Final. Absolute. She drove to her apartment in silence. Sat in her car in the parking lot for an hour, rain hammering the windshield like applause from a crowd she couldn't see. At 3 in the afternoon, she drove to the Portland VA hospital and walked to the intake desk with the cardboard box still in her hands. The intake form asked the question she'd been asking other people for 18 years: PTSD, depression, suicidal ideation. She checked all 3 boxes and sat in the waiting room surrounded by veterans whose haunted eyes mirrored her own, reduced from healer to patient, from warrior to broken thing, from Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez to just another casualty waiting for someone to fix her. The waiting room smelled like old coffee and industrial cleaner, the air heavy with the weight of histories no one wanted to carry alone. Katie sat with the intake form on her lap and stared at the rain-streaked windows. She had saved the general's life. She had done exactly what she was trained to do, what she had done in combat zones under fire, what she had done for 18 years without hesitation. And for that, she had lost everything. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was knowing that Hargrove would survive this. That his connections, his network, his years of building relationships with board members would insulate him from the consequences. That he would spin the narrative for nurse acting outside her scope, a rogue employee, a credential problem that proved why hierarchies existed in the first place. The hospital would settle any potential lawsuit. The general would recover. And Katie would sit in a VA waiting room with a patient intake form, her hands that had held lives together reduced to filling out boxes. That was the worst part. That was the part that made her understand, sitting there alone while rain continued to hammer the parking lot outside, that the world did not reward people like her. The world punished them. The world ordered them to disappear. The rotor wash hit the parking lot first. 3 Marine helicopters descending like judgment from the sky, their blades hammering the air into submission, scattering debris across the asphalt in a violent spiral. The UH-60M Blackhawks moved with terrifying precision, their doors already opening before the landing skids touched concrete. Inside the VA hospital waiting room, Katie heard it before she saw it, the distinctive thud of rotors that made every nerve in her body stand at attention, a sound she'd heard 17 times in her life, always moments before everything changed. The doors burst open. Not politely opened. Burst. 8 Marines in full dress uniform, dress blues so dark they looked like they'd been cut from midnight itself, boots striking the linoleum with synchronized percussion that echoed through 3 hallways. Their call signs were stitched into the silence: 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse written across their bearing like scarred knuckles. The lead Marine's eyes swept the room with the predatory efficiency of someone trained to locate targets in chaos. Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez. We have orders to locate and transport. It wasn't a request. It was a command, delivered with the kind of certainty that made every civilian in the waiting room stop breathing. Katie didn't stand immediately. She looked at the intake form in her hands, the one that reduced 18 years of surgical operations, combat medical interventions, and classified extractions to a single checkbox. Patient. Just a patient. But her eyes tracked the Marine who'd spoken, reading the rank on his collar, the unit insignia on his sleeve, the tactical briefing that had clearly included her photograph because his eyes locked on hers with zero hesitation. She stood. Slowly. Not from fear, composure doesn't break from fear, but from the weight of what those helicopters meant. Classification boundaries had just been shattered. The Pentagon had decided the secret was worth breaking. That meant everything about her was about to become visible in ways she'd spent 3 years learning to prevent. The Marines flanked her with the courtesy given to officers, not prisoners. This wasn't a raid. This was an extraction. The 6-vehicle convoy was already positioned outside, their engines running, their doors open, waiting. The drivers didn't look at her. They looked through her, seeing only the destination, a journey that lasted 18 minutes, though Katie counted every one of them. The convoy moved through Portland traffic with the kind of priority that made civilian cars pull to the shoulder, Marines riding with one hand on the door handle, watching the intersections pass. Sacred Heart appeared through the rain like a memory she'd been trying to forget. The convoy didn't slow at the main entrance. It stopped. The Marines formed a corridor, a human tunnel of dress uniforms and dress swords, from the parking lot to the loading dock to the central atrium. Katie walked through them without looking left or right, though every hospital staff member in visual range had stopped moving. Doctors. Nurses. The nurse who'd made the comment about new nurses is in the break room. All of them standing frozen as she passed, understanding only that something institutional had just shifted underneath them. The atrium doors opened. The hospital administrator was waiting with papers in shaking hands. The words came out like they were being read from a script written by someone who understood the price of lying to the military. Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez. Your security clearance file is being declassified in real time. Your current designation, 18 years Naval Special Operations. Current rank, Senior Chief Petty Officer. Assignments, JSOC Task Force 121 Attachments, 160th SAW Night Stalkers Medical Support, Direct Pentagon Consultation. The administrator's voice cracked. Combat Medical Badge. Awarded twice, Iraq, 2007. Afghanistan, 2009. Purple Heart. First citation, IED fragmentation, 2008. Second citation, Small Arms Fire, 2010. Third citation, Blast Radius Casualty, 2011. 3 Purple Hearts. Spoken separately. Each one its own sentence. Each one changing the way every person in the atrium understood who was standing in front of them. A SEAL team leader stepped forward. His tactical patch said DevGru, though nothing on his uniform matched the official insignia. He moved like the kind of quiet that comes from having already survived things most humans can't imagine. Senior Chief Rodriguez led the extraction at Sanjin Valley, Helmand Province, 2009. Target location was a CIA safe house compromised by Taliban forces. 14 civilians sheltering there. 1 Navy SEAL with a sucking chest wound. Senior Chief performed 3 emergency field interventions under small arms fire, established patient airway management with improvised equipment, managed hemorrhage control with combat gauze and tourniquets, and coordinated extraction under fire. All 14 civilians extracted alive. The SEAL, Lieutenant Commander James Cross, walked out of Walter Reed 68 days later. That's because of her. The room was so quiet you could hear the rain hammering the windows outside, that particular sound of storm violence that made the hospital feel smaller, more fragile. Every person standing in the atrium understood they'd just learned something that changed everything they thought they knew about the woman in scrubs standing between two Marines. A two-star general stepped forward. His uniform carried the weight of actual authority, not institutional position. His voice was calibrated to cut through noise without raising volume, the kind of voice that makes subordinates move. Dr. Marcus Hargrove, you are hereby terminated from this facility effective immediately. Hargrove appeared then, stepping from behind a pillar where he'd been watching, perhaps hoping he could somehow negotiate his way out of what was clearly coming. General, I'm the chief of cardiology here. I have board connections. I have a contract. The general didn't pause for his objections. You endangered the life of a decorated war hero through deliberate clinical negligence. You deleted medical documentation to protect your professional reputation. You orchestrated the termination of a service member operating under classified orders. Your actions constitute a matter of national security. The general's pause was surgical. Security, escort Dr. Hargrove from the building. All building. All affiliated facilities. Hospital security, the same two guards who'd escorted Katie out with her belongings in a cardboard box 3 days ago, now approached Hargrove. He flinched. Actually flinched, his face cycling through denial and rage and finally the particular expression of a man realizing his world had just ended with no possibility of reconstruction. His badge was cut in half at the admissions desk, the plastic splitting with a sound like breaking teeth. Your medical privileges are permanently revoked, a hospital board chair read from a document written by people with authority far beyond Portland. Medical license review proceedings begin Monday. Any attempt to practice medicine in any state will result in federal prosecution. The other physician stepped away from Hargrove. Actually created physical distance. His residents stared at their shoes. The nurses on the second-floor balcony watched him being walked toward the parking lot holding a cardboard box identical to the one Katie had carried 3 days earlier. Identical, right down to the fluorescent light fixture tape still stuck to one corner. He passed an honor guard of 16 Marines standing at attention, their presence saying everything about whose side history had decided to take. The hospital administrator approached Katie slowly, carefully, like approaching something that might detonate. Senior Chief, we would like to offer you the position of Director of Emergency Medicine. Full authority. Full authority over all credentialing and hiring. We want to. Katie shook her head. I'm done hiding. Those 5 words landed in the atrium like ordnance. The weight of them, the finality of them. General Marsh appeared from the ICU corridor, pole in one hand, the other hand rising slowly to salute. The movement was careful, he was still recovering, still fragile, but his eyes were fully alive, fully present, fully understanding that the woman who'd saved his life twice had just decided to stop apologizing for being a hero. David was there. Katie's son, standing in dress uniform, captain insignia on his collar, tears streaming down his face, hand rising to salute his mother. The entire Marine detail moved in synchronized motion, every hand snapping upward in unison, every head held at perfect attention. Katie's hands came up slowly. The salute was military regulation, but her composure finally fractured. Tears streamed down her face as she held the salute, not breaking position, not breaking bearing, just finally allowing the weight of 18 years to show. 6 months later, she stood in the Oval Office wearing her dress uniform, the ribbons cascading across her chest in colors that matched nothing civilian. The president pinned the Presidential Citizens Medal directly to her chest while General Marsh stood beside her, fully recovered, back on active duty, his hand steady as stone. That same day, David sent her a photograph. Dr. Hargrove sat at a folding table outside a strip mall in East Portland, a sagging banner reading Hargrove Insurance, low rates hanging behind him like a surrender flag. His medical career destroyed as thoroughly as he'd attempted to destroy hers. Katie deleted the photograph without comment. Instead, she accepted the position of Chief Medical Officer for the VA's regional hospital network, building a program designed specifically to hire and protect veterans transitioning to civilian medical careers. No one would have to hide who they were. No one would have to disappear. At the first orientation, she placed her worn combat boots on the podium in front of 40 veteran nurses and medics. The same boots she'd kept in her locker at Sacred Heart, the boots that had walked through Helmand Province and combat zones and the civilian world trying to pretend she was ordinary. She looked at each of their faces and said, "You've already proven yourself in the hardest conditions imaginable. Anyone who can't see that doesn't deserve your service." The final image, Katie walking the VA hospital halls in scrubs with rank insignia embroidered on the shoulder, finally visible, finally whole, finally home. Not all heroes wear capes. Some wear scrubs. If Katie's story resonates with you, if you've ever hidden who you truly are to fit into a system, if you've ever been underestimated and proven people wrong, like, subscribe, and comment below. Tell us about the unsung heroes in your own community. The ones doing extraordinary things while the world looks the other way.